dog status, I'm a big dog vet. I pull up on the block.
In March of 2021, a year after the pandemic first started, I decided to do a little weekend trip to New York City with my friend and guest on episode 6 of The Spillover, Isabel Brown. Now, Isabel had a scheduled event in the city that Monday, and I asked her to tag along after waking up to find that my boyfriend at the time, after not speaking to me for over a week as a passive-aggressive way to break up with me, had flown across the country to party in a different city for St. Patrick's Day without telling me. And I am a very tit-for-tat type of person. So when I discovered his trip, I thought, okay, two can play this game. And I booked my own trip to New York City for a girls' weekend with Isabel. The first thing that we noticed was how eerily empty the city was. I mean, it was like a total ghost town. No cars in the street or people on the sidewalks. I actually was able to take pictures in the street with no people in the background in New York City. I mean, restaurants weren't allowed to have people inside at all, or they were only allowed to have a limited amount. So they opened inside restaurants on the street, the stupidest thing ever, which I still don't understand. And so we ate at those in the cold. But there was one restaurant operating as normal, and it even had an in-house DJ. It was conservative owned, surprise, surprise. So we met up with some of our other friends that work in the conservative movement for a fun night out. And we weren't even there, I don't think, for a full half hour before a girl who was completely wasted came up to our table, started screaming and fighting with us. She was going absolutely bat-you-know-what crazy, knocking over our wine glasses, pulling the tablecloth off the table, screaming and crying on the floor like a toddler. I mean, it was a full-blown temper tantrum meltdown from a grown woman who was maybe slightly older than me. And you know what she kept screaming about? I've been locked in my apartment for a year. I haven't been out in a full year. She was having a complete and utter mental breakdown, movie style, and was carried out flailing by about 3 bouncers and then just dropped on the sidewalk right outside the restaurant. That woman wasn't the first person to completely snap under the suffocating overreach of big government in the last 2 years. In July of 2020, in my city of Scottsdale, Arizona, Melissa Lively experienced something similar. Except it didn't happen to her. It was her in a Target. She became a viral social media Karen, covered in USA Today, The Washington Post, and more. Melissa spent countless hours going down various rabbit holes all over the internet about government conspiracies and QAnon at the beginning of the pandemic, just trying to find meaning in the madness of 2020. But ultimately, it ended in her losing her mind in public over a mask display, all while yelling to employees that they were only telling her to calm down because she was a blonde white woman. What happened next, though? After that, elevates the story to a new level and sheds light on a topic that isn't often talked about: the treatment of mental health patients from within American institutions. This woman's own husband called the police on her as she kicked and screamed to police that she had special government clearance from the White House. She had no idea that she was headed for institutionalization, like full-on Girl Interrupted style. And if you haven't seen that 1999 film with Winona Ryder, Angelina Jolie, and Brittany Murphy, you have homework to do. Here today to talk about leaving the QAnon cult and ultimately getting locked up for snapping about being locked down is Melissa Lively on The Spillover. One of the most ironic things about your story for me, Melissa, is that you actually worked in PR. And so the number one thing that is a PR crisis person you try to avoid with other people actually happens to you. So walk us through that and elaborate just how successful you were in PR and the types of clients you had and the work that you were doing.
Yeah, well, I started my career in television. I was an anchor and reporter. I worked for the CBS network. I worked in PR for almost 20 years. I'd owned my own firm for 10. I specialize in luxury and lifestyle. So some of the biggest and best brands in the world I've worked with, I mean, from hotel brands to billion-dollar developers to restaurants, fashion lines, you name it. I was really, really fortunate to work with some really cool businesses and brands and really made an incredible career for myself. Prior to the pandemic, I was at the height of my career. I was just, flying on cloud nine, and just everything just crumbled, in March.
Weren't you CEO of your own
I am
PR
CEO.
company?
Yes, I've owned my own firm, the Brand Consortium, for 11 years. And, we work with the best of the best.
So when you saw that mask display in Target and you decided to take your phone out and film yourself destroying it, I mean, what was honestly going through your mind?
Well, I had been sort of posting, a lot of my thoughts and feelings and experiences in the pandemic, for a while. I am known as, a very influential voice in the community and in the business world. And, when I saw things start to go sideways that we didn't really understand, we didn't have a good explanation for, I had clients that were concerned, business owners that were concerned, influential people in the community that were concerned with what was happening, that things weren't adding up. Nobody was speaking out about it, and nobody was willing, to come forward and say, this isn't right. So I sort of stepped into that role early in the pandemic. And, I have a certain je ne sais quoi, about who I am, and, a little bit of a flippant attitude, that's funny and fun. And so, I kind of took a dose of humor to what I was posting and saying and doing. And people were very entertained. I mean, I guess you could call me, I'm probably one of the elder millennials.
That's what I say too.
So I don't really consider myself an influencer, but that's what I do. Like, that's how I make a living. I influence, I represent brands. I tell people what's cool. I set trends. And so, when I started to talk about what I was seeing, and what was concerning, from the government level and everything else, like, people were a little bit taken aback, and they were like, wow, I, didn't expect that from you, but I am listening, and people were paying attention. So I think it really started, just sort of posting on social media when the stuff that I was posting sort of took a turn.
Had you ever posted kind of controversial or political content ever before? Or was the pandemic the first time your followers ever saw that from you?
Never. It's really my job, as a publicist, to appeal to a lot of different audiences. Like I said, I work with luxury brands and affluent audiences. So I appeal to everybody, every culture, every type of background. And so, no, I had really not done a whole lot of political outreach outside of things that were, impactful in my own community, making sure that our police are well funded, that our nonprofits are supported, things like that. Nothing, to the political landscape that we experience now.
Right. And so when you saw the mask display and you're like, okay, I got to just show just the insanity of this. Were you planning on, like, I'm going to just go ape on this? Or did it just happen, like, in the moment? Like, you were just showing how insane this is. Like, why are they selling masks? They're forcing us to do this. And then all of a sudden you're just like, you know what? Screw it. And then just started knocking stuff over. I mean, how planned was it for you?
It was not planned.
That's what I figured.
No, it was not planned at all. But it happened on the 4th of July.
Oh, no.
Which, normally, my husband and I spend quite a bit of time in Europe over the summer. And, that was just the icing on the cake of everything else, just being taken away from me. I had, by then, this was July, I had already lost 90% of my business. I'd been locked inside.
Why had you lost so much of your business already?
Because so many of the businesses and brands that I work with were the ones that were immediately impacted by lockdown. So anything that was consumer facing, hotels, restaurants, entertainment, events, anything really shopping, lifestyle oriented, when the word came that you have to shut down your business and not operate, immediately, my clients were like, well, we're not going to be open. So we can't, why would we have an expensive PR firm on retainer right now? So, my income, stopped. And there was no, what was the most frightening for me, at the beginning of the pandemic was that there was never a clear off-ramp for where any of this ended. And so, I brought that, example up and nobody, had an answer for it, and, so I was still working on a few little things, but we at the same time I was also petrified. I mean, if you remember at the beginning of the pandemic, I am a total germaphobe. I work in public relations. I deal with, dozens and dozens of people every day. I run events, I run parties. Like, I'm used to kissing everybody on the cheek and giving hugs and shaking hands. And so, I've always been, a little bit conscientious about germs. I would get sick once a year, but have a great immune system because of all of that. But, when they're at the beginning, when you're seeing pictures of people keeling over on the sidewalk in Wuhan, supposedly, that freaked me out. And I was like, I told my husband, I'm like, cancel your meetings, you're staying home. I'm staying home. And I kind of...
So it wasn't like from the beginning, what you're trying to say is that from the beginning, you were not this go against the man type of person. You were very compliant.
No, absolutely not. I was extremely compliant.
Yeah.
In fact, in the beginning, before, everybody, ended up shutting their businesses down, my phone was ringing off the hook with clients that were like, well, what should we do? Because, we have to stay open and run our business. But should we make people wear masks? Should we limit our capacity? Should we cut down? What is the PR fallout from that? If we do that, if we don't do that, because there were all these people at the time, like say you were a restaurant and you didn't, there's all of these like virtue signalers that were like voluntarily shutting down their business, at the beginning of March. And everybody was like, wait, what are you doing? So other businesses were like, I'm not going to do that, but if you didn't voluntarily shut down your business, there were all these people calling you out, on Yelp and on the internet and everything else saying, so-and-so didn't shut down their business. They're super spreaders. They're this, that, and the other. So that was the type of phone call that I was fielding. What should we do? How do we respond to this? We have these issues. What happens if we have a case pop up at our business? Like that at the beginning was what I was dealing with. And, being in PR, I am always very liability minded, and what is the fallout going to be? So of course, at the very beginning, I was like, oh, well, we have to minimize any brand damage. We can't have people out there trashing businesses on the internet. We have to do, we have to follow the guidance. We have to do what's asked of us, and let's just do it. And it wasn't until later, by summer that, we'd probably spent 90 days, on lockdown light in Arizona. It wasn't as bad here as it was other places, but it was bad. I mean, there were weeks and weeks and weeks that I didn't leave my house, and I was one of the ones early on wearing a mask in the grocery store. I was, which sounds insane now, but like washing the groceries with Lysol and bleach. It would take 3 hours for me to go grocery shop and bring things home. And
we didn't know this had never happened before. You know what I mean? So all of us were. I remembered crying watching the news in March of 2020, and and just being like, "Is this the end of the world?" Yeah. I was just like, I haven't even had little baby chicken nuggets yet. I was just like freaking out. So I do not blame you at all. And then the thing is everything you're describing. Losing so much of your business. When you saw the mask display, do you think that was what had triggered you, or do you think it could have been anything that day? You were ready to just snap. That just happened to be it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that the masks, in particular, are such a symbol of this authoritarian overreach and this tyranny, that I come from a long line of people who have fought, for their lives, in the face of tyranny and authoritarianism and have survived. So I think that my survival instinct just kicked in. And when I saw the masks that day, I just snapped. I just snapped.
In the clip that went viral, that first clip of you in Target knocking over the mask display and everything, the employees come up to you. They're like, what is going on? After the video stops, explain to us what happened that we didn't see.
So after the video stopped, I mean, I realized, quickly, and what's so funny about like this whole thing, and I think the reason why it went so viral and it was so shocking is that anybody who knows me, has this picture of me in their mind, you're polished, you're successful, you're professional, you're stylish, you're this, you're that, you're well-spoken, you help other people be well-spoken. It just was so unbelievable, that somebody like me would just completely come unhinged like that. And I mean, that's the result of lockdowns. But when this happened, I came to and I felt so bad. I was like, and there's a second video that's circulating online. Of course, it doesn't go viral like the first one.
Yep.
But there's a second video online, where I am like apologizing. I picked up all the masks. I put them back in my cart. I gave them my American Express card. I said, "I'm sorry. Let me pay for these. Like I just lost it. I'm sorry." And they weren't having it. Like
what were they saying to you?
They did call an officer to the store, and they were like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "You know what? I just lost it. I am sorry." And they asked me to leave, and there's some video of me like saying bad people, calling them sheep and stuff, which I mean. Well,
the truth hurts. I mean, is it like a little bit of aggressive? It's like, oh my gosh, she actually said it. But we're all thinking it, Melissa. That's the thing. We're all thinking it.
Yeah.
They are sheep. And we're 2 years later now, and they're still following these guidelines. Nothing has changed. They're adding more guidelines, and so you're not wrong. You just said what everybody is thinking.
Right. Right. It's the stupidest game of Simon Says I've ever seen. So anyway, so I left the Target. To backtrack the story a little bit, so at that point, I was staying in a hotel by myself because my husband and I were kind of arguing about what I was posting online.
Before this moment.
Like,
no.
Yeah, because as I got more and more upset and like was posting more and more content, and like at that point, like I'm very into wellness and yoga and taking care of myself and all of that type of stuff. And like, I was just kind of off the rails at that point. I wasn't sleeping. I wasn't eating. I was just on, my phone and watching the news and looking at the internet all hours of the day and night. Like all of my self-care practices were completely out the window. And my husband knew something was wrong.
What were you posting that was concerning him?
Well, at that point, I had kind of gotten down the rabbit hole into what I now understand to be QAnon content. And I say that in, quotation marks, because I think we've all seen it, and the way that, and I don't know, where people ask me, like, oh, do you know what Q is or where it came from? I don't know where it came from. I don't know what it is. I know, it's been co-opted, over and over and over again. And, it's very hard, even as somebody who is educated, intelligent, and, does PR for a living, it's hard to separate fact from reality at this point. I mean, I think that's part of what's turned people so inside out is everything is so confusing and the information is constantly changing and you don't know what to believe and you don't know what's what. So I had been sharing some stuff that, I think was disturbing to people. I think, a lot, well, what's so funny about that is, it's that old adage is like, what's the difference between a conspiracy theory and reality? About 6 months. So at the time, it was stuff about, vaccine, they were going to mandate vaccines. They were going to do all this stuff. This is a control mechanism. This is part of this globalist takeover. It was all of this stuff that, I think for most people is very frightening, and they don't want to wrap their mind around the reality that this could be happening, is happening. So, I think that was the stuff that really upset people at the time. I think it's a very different world now than it was, when I had my incident. And I think, at the time, people could not wrap their mind around, that this disease has been politicized, that, vaccinations has been politicized. Nothing has been, and I'm speaking from a publicist perspective, somebody who is an expert in communications, has done this for 20 years. Everything about the way that the communication about this pandemic has been from the very beginning has been completely the opposite of what any expert in PR would tell you in terms of informing the public, being transparent, making people feel comfortable with things that are happening. I mean, it's just been completely sideways. So, and I think, anybody who has 2 IQ points to rub together at this point, is scratching their head, like, what is really going on? So at the time, I think it really freaked people out. I think a lot more people would not be as disturbed about the stuff I was posting now as they were then.
Before that, did you and your husband see eye to eye typically politically and just worldview, or have you guys always been a little bit different?
No, we absolutely, saw eye to eye on our worldview. I mean, we've been together for 20 years. He's my best friend. Like, we're very like-minded. I think that where he drew the line is he just did not want, the attention, and it was generating. I have to say, I mean, everything that I do seems to generate attention. And that's by design. I mean, that's, if I wouldn't be good at my job if I wasn't good at creating a buzz and starting a fire and all that stuff. But I think that, at that point in time, my husband, was disappointed that, I was sort of bringing, negativity, and scaring people, and waking people up when they didn't want to be disturbed.
Were you following accounts like Little Miss Patriot and stuff like that? Like, where were you getting this information that you were sharing that kind of had your husband on edge and other people on edge?
Well, a lot of the information that I was getting was kind of, interestingly enough, like originating from some of the New Age pages.
That is interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And I consider myself a very spiritual person. I have a very strong connection with God and my higher power and my beliefs. And, I don't try to get super in the weeds on religious dogma, but I believe what I believe, and, you can't tell me anything different. So it was some of like the New Age, like woo-woo stuff, but not even really that. It was like a little bit of that, but also like, some fitness people and influencers and people who are diet and just wellness, nutrition people. And sadly, I kind of feel like that whole world has been sort of unfairly stigmatized, in like spreading misinformation and, boo, natural health.
Like Gwyneth Paltrow goop.
Exactly. Like that, if you had to characterize, sort of what my affinity would be for that world, I am totally goopy. I'm
She's
very
a goop.
goopy. I'm a gooper. So that's where it originated. And it wasn't like, I think the way that like QAnon got sort of sold, which was embarrassing because like every time I have a conversation with somebody about it, like I hate talking about it, obviously, but like they act like it's like these like weird, and don't get me wrong, like there's totally like a sect of like crazy people in the basement,
Yes,
that have no teeth and like, are wackadoos. But there was this other like, and I don't know how it translated or how it came full circle. I mean, there are like researchers trying to figure this out, but like how it sort of infiltrated this wellness space. And that was the type of stuff that I was sharing. So it wasn't like overtly, harmful, at least in my eyes. And I really thought, honestly, I swear, I really thought that I was helping people, in sharing this information, because my mindset was, well, I want to know, I want to know the truth. I want to know the truth about what's going on. I just, that's just what type of, it doesn't matter that it's even this, like, that is what type of person that I am. I'm like, give it to me straight. Just tell me the facts. Like, I want to know. So that was the type of stuff that I was sharing. And, I think it was the frequency and, the fact that I was, going off brand, for who I am, as a person, that I think was freaking
Who
people
wasn't
out.
going off brand in the beginning of the pandemic? Every person's life was completely upended and completely changed. And that's why the QAnon stuff is so fascinating to me, because I get it. I get why and how that infiltrated regular culture. It wasn't like you were trolling and scrolling through 4chan.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, I understand what you're talking about, because normal people in my everyday life, like, people with regular jobs, cute girls that you and I would hang out with, people like, these are not, like you're saying, basement dweller type people were getting involved in this stuff, and it wasn't coming from accounts that said Q-Anon. That's what nobody understood that that's what they were, unless you were really, really deep into politics and like in that community like I am, like I work in this every day. I understood the differences, but to normal people that do not just consume this every single 5 seconds, it was so hidden in everyday type of culture, what you're talking about, health and wellness and all these different things. It was normal looking accounts with cute graphics and stuff. It wasn't this like doomsday account or something, one QAnon account. So it duped people. And why? It's not crazy to me that people would be looking for answers like that in something so obscure, because when we go to the places that we're supposed to be getting trusted information, like our news, like entertainment, like, our health officials, they lie. They keep lying over and over and over again. How can we trust them? So naturally, people are going to be like, well, clearly I can't trust you, so I'm going to look for something else for information about what is going on and impacting me on a day-to-day basis. And, still they refuse to answer questions.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, and that's the whole thing too, is just like, we have gotten so reliant on technology for information. And it's like, there used to be this thing where you would just like go outside and talk to people and like take the temperature, of how people were doing and how they were feeling. And, you talk to this person, that person. And that's, people don't think of that anymore, which is like insane to me. But like, that's honestly like really what brought me back down to reality, was like getting away from so much technology consumption and getting back to like just talking to people and just connecting with real people, because the world is not as it seems on the internet when you really connect with human beings.
And big picture ideas, some of the stuff that was being covered, like human trafficking with children being a problem, absolutely real.
Well, and that was the non-starter for me. And I think especially women who sort of found themselves, being kind of pulled into this sort of what we understand now to be QAnon sphere. But, being somebody who has a heart for children, and I've done a tremendous amount of philanthropic work for human trafficking nonprofits here in the Valley, that immediately spoke to me. And, that was like one of the come to Jesus moments where I was just like, I know that I have influence and I have a voice and I am capable of communicating effectively and people listen to me. So I am going to use every resource I have to push this information out, because there are children, that was my understanding at the time, is, there are children who are victims of this, and I'm not going to stand for it, and I could at least feel good about that I was doing something to, hashtag save the children.
How soon after you had started live streaming in Target did your husband or friends or family members start texting you or saying, hey, what is going on here? Or was it a while before they had noticed?
Well, actually, in the few days, before the Target incident, people started, to text me or whatever, like, hey, are you okay? Like, thinking about you, what's going on? And people ask me like all the time, like, well, why didn't anybody stop you? Like, why didn't anybody stop you from doing all this? And it's like, when you own your own business, you're as successful as I've been, there are not a lot of people who you will answer to.
Well, you're an adult also.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, after the Target incident happened, obviously my phone started to blow up pretty quickly. It went viral very quickly. And like I said, I was staying in a hotel, and I had 2 policemen come over to the hotel and knock on the door, and I answered.
Were you scared?
No, I wasn't scared, because, I was like, whatever, I wasn't, thinking exactly tremendously clearly at that time, but I answered the door. I was like, and they were just like, hey, somebody called and, we wanted to come over. I didn't even know how they knew where I was staying, but they wanted to come over and just do a welfare check and, see how I was doing. And I told them I was fine. And they were like, okay, bye. So, that was the first, that was the first engagement with the police that day. And it was fine, What everybody saw happen in my garage later that day was because I went back to my house to get some shoes, because I was going to my first ever protest. Oh, I was planning on it, didn't make it. I was planning on going to my first ever protest. There was a big protest downtown against the mask mandate, and I was planning on going. Didn't get there though.
Let's talk about the moment in your garage, because this is the part that really blew my mind. It was your husband who had called the police. Did you know that he was going to do that, or was it a surprise?
Oh, it was quite a surprise. I basically what had happened, I came back to my house to get shoes, and, my husband, bless him, before any of this happened and I went to go stay in a hotel, like I said, my husband and I had been together a long time. He's my best friend. We have 2 little dogs, When he had basically given me an ultimatum, before I left for the hotel, and he was like, you need to choose right now, between this family and what you are doing on the internet, posting all the stuff, talking about Q-Anon, whatever, or that's it. Like we're done. And I was like, I don't know how you can possibly ask me to choose between my family, that I love, or, this important thing that I am doing to spread awareness about, child trafficking and human trafficking and what is going on. Like, how can you ask me to choose between that and speaking out against all of this injustice that's happening and all of these lockdowns and this mask? Like, how can you ask me to do that? I'm doing this for everybody. Like, that was really where my mind was at the time. And, so I was just like, you know what? That's fine. I will pack my suitcase and I will leave. So that's how I ended up in the hotel in the first place. So when I came back to my house, I opened the garage, my husband came out and he's like, I don't know why you're here. Like, you said you didn't want to be here. And he could tell. I mean, like, he took one look at me. Like, I was in, like, workout clothes. I had no makeup on. I hadn't blow dried my hair. Like, I looked like a disaster. Like, and so he just made the executive decision that intervention was needed. And, of course I was furious. Of course I was furious. But I understand now why he did what he did.
See, this is something with me. I don't know why I am like this, but my whole life, loyalty is the most important thing to me. And I really need to go to therapy and like ask why this is. But I mean, when I feel like somebody stabs me in the back or doesn't have my back in something, I will cut them out of my life. Like, literally never speak to them again. I have gone years without speaking to anyone. Now, I'm not sharing this like this is a good thing. I'm just saying this is definitely a character flaw of mine, but it hurts me deeply to feel that way. And so what's astonishing to me is that you're sitting here saying that, like, I understand why my husband did what he did, and I'm like glad he did it, because if someone in my life, a husband or a best friend or my parent or anyone, were to call the police on me and like have me taken away, I don't know how my marriage would recover. I don't know how those relationships would recover, because I just never would have spoken to them again, straight up.
Yeah.
So, but you were not mad at him. In the moment, I would have been screaming at my husband. I just know me. I would have been like, how could you do this to me? But you weren't saying that. You were just telling the police that you had like White House clearance. And
and honestly, to be honest, I was kind of surprised that it went down the way it did. But when I listened to the video now, and I'm like, yeah, I would have probably been like, yep, take her in. Like, like I sounded.
Because you said that you were being sarcastic, but
yeah.
Like, honestly, Melissa, when I listen to it, I think it sounds dead serious, which just speaks to the crisis that you were in emotionally. But it sounds dead serious to me. I mean, did you truly believe that you had secret government clearance and that you knew things that were going on that other people didn't?
No. But like, I guess where everybody who had been like watching my stories, like I said, I have a very sarcastic, sort of general tone and was sort of being facetious. And so I think everybody who was watching the whole series on Instagram, I was just talking to somebody today who was like, oh, I thought it was hilarious. But, I think they would have gotten it. Unfortunately, the police were not watching my Instagram. Right. So they, when you have somebody who is hysterical like that and appears to be a crisis, I think that, that was probably the right move. And, as far as my husband goes, like he had tried, to talk to me and like calm me down and say, you need to sleep, you need to put your phone down, you need to do all this stuff. Like he was pleading with me and pleading with me. And I was just refusing, to do any of that just because I felt like I had this mission, and that's kind of, I think when you kind of get caught up in that, that's sort of why you see people get like radicalized, I guess, almost, because you just feel like you have this mission and you just can't stop. So I just got so caught up in it.
It sounds very manic to me.
Yeah.
Had you ever been diagnosed with any sort of mental illness or struggles before?
Never. I had never been diagnosed with a mental illness or anything like that, ever, ever, ever. And, I've been through some tough stuff in my life, but it's always just been like, pick yourself up, work hard and just, stay focused. So I think, and I talk about, kind of what happened and how I got through it. But, I think a lot of where that kind of mental break sort of comes from, is trauma over your lifetime that you don't deal with. And then you put, an incredibly...
a big stressor.
Stress like the pandemic and the lockdowns. And just for me, I had kind of been, I'd been through some stuff and I'd just been holding it together and holding it together and holding it together my whole life. If it wasn't that, it probably eventually would have been something else, but the pandemic was a big something.
When the police start talking to you and they're like, okay, well, she's clearly not in the right mind. Did they put you in handcuffs and start walking you away? What happened? Yep.
They put me in handcuffs. I mean, they were actually, very nice. And
did they say you're under arrest?
No, I wasn't under arrest. They just basically said, they hand me your phone and then they just put handcuffs on. And, I, didn't fight them or struggle or anything. So I honestly had no idea where they were taking me or why.
I would have been so scared. You were not scared. You were calm.
I can't say that I was calm just because I was just so hysterical, but I just think that whole day was just like such a blur of emotions that I think it was just really, obviously if something like that, nothing like that would ever happen right now because I'm, maintaining my homeostasis and my wellness to make sure that I don't run into that problem again. But yeah, I think I was just so in shock that all of that had gone on. I just really couldn't wrap my mind around it.
Where did they take you?
So they took me to a mental health evaluation facility where I ended up spending the next 3 days. And, that's one of the things that really, opened my eyes to the mental health crisis in this country and, just the lack of capability that we have, to address those type of crises and care for people, and when I say care for people, I mean really, truly care for people in a healthy, wholesome environment that promotes healing and promotes wellness, because the situation that I was in was one of the most horrifying, humiliating, demoralizing places imaginable. I've never been to jail, but I would believe that this is very much what jail would be like.
What do you mean by that?
Well, when I got there, you are in, there's no windows. It's all cell block. You walk into a little room, you strip down, they search you, they give you a set of scrubs, they fingerprint you, they watch you shower, you get a threadbare towel, and then you go into this big room where there are all of these like plastic reclining chairs, and they just tell you to sit in one of them. They throw a blanket at you, and in the room is probably 150 men and women of all crisis situations, that have been brought in, mostly by the police.
Like what kinds of situations?
Drug overdoses, people who have been violent, who, for whatever reason have committed a crime, but, have a mental health history. So they don't take them to jail. They take them to this holding facility, basically.
Is it an insane asylum like what we think about from the movies?
I mean, that would be more like the actual psychiatric hospital, which I did end up going to. But the evaluation facility is basically like, they put you in there. All these other people are in there. I mean, there's a lot of screaming. There's a lot of violence.
Did you see anything weird?
Yeah. I mean, I was physically assaulted. I mean, it was, and there's just guards there, and people coming around with a cart basically saying, here's your medication. And you say, well, I don't what medication? Like, I didn't come here with medication. And they just say, oh, it'll make you feel better.
So now as this is happening, now are you saying, why the heck did my husband let me come to this place?
I was furious, absolutely furious.
Were you asking, how long do I have to stay here?
Oh, of course. Yeah, of course.
And so what were they telling you?
So what happens is because you're being evaluated, you see 2 doctors and you basically explain to them, why are you here? And so I'm, all wrapped up in this, whole thing, with Q-Anon. So I'm like, no, you don't understand.
You're still talking about Q while you're in there?
Well, yeah, because I had believed, like, not Q-Anon in particular, but just like human trafficking.
But why were you saying that stuff? You had to have known that was why they had brought you in.
I don't know. They ask you the questions in a way where, they're like, you can't just be like, oh, I was doing this thing on the internet, now I'm here. Like, they ask you these questions in this way where, when you read them back on paper, you're like, oh, okay. Yeah.
You're like, this sounds a little nuts.
Yeah, this sounds nuts.
What legal grounds did they say that you were being taken in on?
In Arizona, I believe that if you are, quote unquote, petitioned, meaning, and basically what that means is, the police officer saw my behavior in the garage, took me to the place and said, and it wasn't even, that's I guess the difference is it was not, my husband called the police, but he's not the one who made it so I had to be in there. It was actually the police officer who brought me to the place, and there's like a form that has to be filled out saying, I basically saw this person acting in a way that I believe is a danger to herself or other people, or statements she made or things, whatever. So, so the policeman filled out the paperwork, and then that was kind of it. I was in the system.
And then how long were you there before being moved to a psychiatric hospital?
I was there for the 3 days. And then after that, they looked at it all. And from what I understand, and like I'm doing a bunch of advocacy work, for in the mental health space for people who, are not necessarily able to advocate for themselves in different organizations, to help kind of remake this mental health system, because it's horrifying.
Yep.
What I understand is 90% of the people, probably more, who get into that evaluation facility are shuffled off to different state hospitals. And once you get into that system is when it, really when the fun begins. And I'm being facetious, but where basically you go through something called mental health court, and you have to, at that point, be able to convince somebody that you're not requiring, state mandated mental health treatment.
So what were you saying to try to convince people? Like, I'm just going nuts because of everything's going on with this pandemic, but I'm not actually nuts.
Yeah, but of course, when you say that,
I know you say I'm not crazy, then you look crazier.
Exactly.
So what do you say?
Exactly. I mean, you learn the laws. You learn how the court works. You read all of the paperwork. Obviously, like I said, I've been a business owner for 20 years.
So were you just studying?
I was studying everything. I looked at all the paperwork. I had an attorney. And that's the other thing, too, is a lot of people who get into that system, do not have the resources. But, at the end of the day, there was not enough to basically say, this person, it takes a lot. I mean, if you look at like the Britney Spears case, which is so horrifying, it does take a lot of pieces in place to make it so, a person's autonomy to make medical decisions for themselves is taken away from them. But the situation that I was in was definitely the first step.
Were they strapping you down, or what were the rooms like? Were they padded rooms?
No, when you got to the hospital, I mean, it wasn't fun. It was, it's not like what you would think a hospital is like. It's, 3 people to a room. You've got this little bed, and
and are they total weirdos?
Well, I mean, some, and that's the problem with standardized, socialized healthcare, is that, yes, I mean, there are people in there who are very mentally ill and require, serious care and, are in a serious crisis situation, that requires, 24-hour supervision, because they could hurt themselves or others. I was not that.
That seems crazy to me that they would room someone like you with someone like that.
That's how the state handles it.
And this is why we need people like you in there now advocating for reform, because it's absolutely, that is insane.
Well, and it was dangerous. I mean, it was dangerous. I saw, women get, very physically assaulted. They obviously, they don't pay people very much. They're not very qualified. It's not, like I go sign myself up for rehab and, it's this cushy tushy thing. Like it was, a cross between a jail and a hospital, and they medicate you, pretty much against your will. And, basically they say, well, if you, it's this whole like weird mind game where like, if you fight back against it or you say no or you advocate for yourself, you say, I don't want that or I don't need that. They're basically like, well, if you don't do this, you're not being compliant, my favorite word. And so, that's grounds to say that you're not well because you're not taking the medicine that we're giving you or whatever it is.
Is it fair to say that you were locked up in an insane asylum because you dared to question the left's narratives on lockdowns and mandates?
Looking back, I mean, it's frightening what happened to me. I've had a lot of people say, you were one of the first people to come out and speak out against the mandates, against the mask mandates, against the lockdowns. At
a little bit of vindication.
A little bit of vindication for sure. But, did I handle myself appropriately? Did I handle myself professionally in the way that I normally would? Was I disrespectful to Target, which is like my favorite store, and people in the store? Are
you not allowed to go back to Target ever?
Are you kidding? I'm at Target every week. Like I love
Nobody
Target.
knows?
No, they know. Actually, I was at Target and somebody came up to me probably about 4 or 5 months ago who was there that day, and she just came up to me, gave me a hug, and she was like, I follow you on Instagram and I've been following your story and I've seen you on TV and I just wanted you to know, like, I'm pulling for you and I'm so happy for you and I'm so glad you got everything sorted out. And she was just like, I knew that day that like something was really wrong and I just felt really bad for you. It was very sweet.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it was very sweet.
Wow, what a turnaround.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah. I mean, and sure, you make no mistake, like there was a while where I was like, I don't think I want to go back in there. Like, are they going to kick me out?
Oh, I'd be so scared to show my face. I would be so, the embarrassment and just like, what do they think of me? Like, I couldn't do it. So that is so, I think it's very cool of you to be like unafraid like that. You're brave.
After you go through what I've been through in being canceled and, having everything, losing everything, working my butt off to get it all back, not a whole lot phases you, and there's not a whole lot that people can say about you or write about you or do anything to really that can bring you down. So I just live my life.
What did you end up saying then? Because you were doing all the studying and all this to try to figure out how can I get out of here? What did you end up saying so that you could get out of the psychiatric hospital and back home? And also, had you had any contact with your husband at all?
Yeah, I'd had some contact with my husband. I mean, he was, really angry with me just because of obviously the whole Target incident. I wish you could understand the level of hate and vitriol that came towards me, my family, pretty much everyone I've ever done business with and ever known. I mean, I am talking husbands and wives of my clients, my hairstylist husband's business, like that, this was just such a weird time where people had absolutely no time on their, or like had nothing but time on their hands just to be vicious. And so, I mean, the phone calls, the death threats, all of this just went on for months and it was just unbearable. So my husband was so angry, at me for exposing us to this. And so, I talked to him a little bit, obviously. But, basically it just came down to, hey, I do not have a mental health history. I have never been diagnosed with a mental health disorder before. I've been very successful business owner for many years. I'm a pillar in the community. I do philanthropy work. Like there were all of these character, testimonials that like my attorney was able to put together saying like, okay, this is what happened, and this was a crisis, that was caused by, unforeseen circumstances and, all of this stuff. But at the end of the day, they were able to make, a very legitimate case saying she's a good person. You know, she's a business owner. She minds her own business. She's a law-abiding citizen. She's never had any of these issues before. You know, you have absolutely no grounds, you know, to mandate this.
Do you feel like the lockdowns that were imposed during the pandemic were just as traumatizing as being locked up in a facility?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, if not, you know, and for me, you know, I am the type of person, you know, totally a type A person. Like I said, I want to know everything that's going on. Give me I don't care if it's good news, it's not bad news. Just tell it to me straight. I want to know. You know, having such a lack of control and changing circumstances. And, you know, it was just very frightening and very traumatizing. And like I said, you know, I lost both of my parents when I was very young. You know, I went through a really hellish, you know, period in my life where, you know, I had no control over anything that was going on. And that brought up very, you know, for me, just on an individual level, I know everybody's experienced the pandemic in different ways, but for me, it just brought up feelings, you know, that I hadn't felt in 20 years. You know?
That lack of control. I think that makes total sense.
And just, you know, it was things that I probably, you know, obviously hindsight is 2020, you know, should have dealt with. But it's like when you're successful and you're living your life and you're thriving, you know, a lot of people don't stop and like pump the brakes and be like, you know, I should go back and unpack that trauma from 20 years ago. Like that'd be great. Like I got a weekend. You're like, nobody does that. Nobody does that. It's not until something happens that like is the straw that breaks the camel's back that all of that comes back. And, you know, for me, you know, which is, and the irony is not lost on me, you know, being that I'm you know, this publicist and a policy professional, that I had the worst PR crisis any imaginable that nobody thought I could come back from to clean up. And, you know, it made me very humble. Everything that has happened to me and being forthcoming with my story, you know, sitting here and talking to you about how I was locked into a mental institution, not on my top 10 things that I enjoy doing. But, you know, I want to do it, you know, because I want people to know, you know, what happened with the lockdowns hurt people. And, you know, it broke people. And if I had $1 every single time I got a message from somebody on Instagram or an email from somebody, especially right after everything happened, saying, you know, I want you to know that you're not alone in this type of situation. I've had a really rough go of it. You know, I had people say, you know, people lost friends, family members to suicide, to overdoses, to divorce, to things like that. And people suffered in private in ways that are just unimaginable. And what happened to me, what everybody got to see, you know, is what a lot of people suffered from privately. And the fact that people came to me and put their hand out and said, you're not alone, you know, I felt it was now a new mission of mine, you know, to reach that hand out to other people and let them know that they're not alone, you know, in the way they feel either.
Well, what really pisses me off, Melissa, and what I think is so unfair when it comes to your story is that everyone, and this is not a political, it's not a political thing. Everybody, left or right, just decent people, always harp on we need to do better for mental health in this country. We need to be there for people when they're going through mental health crisis. And it seems to me that you openly, publicly share online your mental health crisis. You're talking about it, but instead of being there for you in the moment, though, so many people turned on you and were like, we don't want anything to do with her. And then, you know, how you were treated. I just feel like that's so unfair and it's so hypocritical. All these people that preach about how we need to be there for people with mental health issues, and then you go through it. And they're always saying, reach out if you need help, reach out. Well, I don't know how you could possibly ask for help any more than, you know, having a public meltdown like you did. Yeah. And then they just stab you in the back.
Well, and not only that, it was like, you know, when I came forward, you know, and I was forthcoming about what I had experienced, you know, it was just shocking to me that exactly all of those people who you were talking about who are just very like, you know, they're willing to say whatever about mental health because it sounds good.
Yeah, and it gets you likes on Instagram.
I mean, there were some of those people that you were describing were some of the most vicious.
It's
most vicious of my situation. And it's like, you know, all right, you know, I'll just keep on, you know, doing my thing. But it's like, what was really the most disturbing was like when I was at the lowest of the low, you know, and I had come out of the hospital and, you know, not to say like, okay, I didn't, you know, I had this crisis. I had been through the hospital system. You know, when you come out of that, you know, when I came out of that on the other side, I had, you know, my husband was essentially leaving me.
Yeah, I want to know about that.
He you know, he when all of that was happening and people were threatening him and all this stuff, he had filed for a divorce. I had nowhere to go. I had no one to call.
So when you get out of the facility finally, after what, 5 days? A week?
Seven.
Okay,
guess, yeah.
so after a week, you get out of the psychiatric hospital. Where do they put you? I mean, you're just free to go?
Well, yeah, I was free to go. A dear friend of mine picked me up, and I had a family friend who has a property in Palm Springs that he wasn't using, so he was just like, come, lay low and hang out here, and I was not feeling good, when I had lost everything.
Did you try to call your husband?
He did not want anything to do with me at that point. And at that point, like, I was really angry at him too, for all the reasons that you mentioned. Like, it took me a long time to get past the whole, why did you call the police on me? I could not wrap around my head, that he would do that to me. But, again, when I finally got, the appropriate, like, therapeutic treatment, I could actually talk on a level where, like, I could see in his eyes when he's looking at me, my eyes telling me, like, I love you so much. I care about you more than anything. I had no idea, where you were at. I couldn't see. He just told me, he said, you just had the scariest look on your face that I have ever seen. Like, I just couldn't connect with you. Like, I'd never. So when he explained it like that, and he was just bawling, that is when it, like, finally got through to me that, like, something was, like, really, I was going through something that, like, it really freaked him out. And he in the best of intentions, he had no other choices. He didn't know what else to do.
Had you been diagnosed with anything while you were in the hospital?
Well, they try and throw a diagnosis at you, as part of the mental health court, because that's the case that they make. They basically say, okay, well, we've analyzed her for, the last 7 days or whatever, and we believe that based on the reason that she's here and this, that, and the other, that she has this. And so, all of any of your other health records and stuff, again, if you do not have an attorney and have somebody who, can pull all of that stuff and say, no, here are her health records. Here is, what medication she takes, what medication she doesn't take. There's no proof of this. So you're telling me, a doctor who's seen her 3 times in 7 days, you're telling me that she's got this disorder that is life-changing? And so they, obviously it's illegal, like anything else, like the mask mandates, like the vaccine mandates, anything. It's a legal fight. So if you come in, you're prepared and you make your case, and they're like, okay, they back off of it, I guess. And that's exactly what happened.
Okay, so how much time had passed between being let go or becoming an outpatient of the facility or whatever to actually speaking to your husband again and meeting up? How long did you guys go without talking to each other after that?
Well, obviously there's administrative reasons why you have to talk to your husband, cars and stuff like that.
Yeah, but really talk.
So, probably about another week, obviously, I was really sad, and, like, I missed my dogs, and, I didn't know what to do with myself. Like, I found myself, like, I had lost, I was unemployed at that point. I had lost my business. Like, a lot of my clients had, like, big brands, and probably patronized. Like, they were in a position where, cancel culture came to them, and they were like, is this your girl? And they, basically had to denounce me in a really public way. Global brands that everybody knows and loves.
Well, as a PR professional, is that what you would have advised them to do if it was not even you in this situation? If it was somebody else, would you have said, yes, denounce her?
What I know about cancel culture now and the knee-jerk reaction that we see, with the internet, and probably not. I would have figured out a way to minimize the damage and, do it in a way that's respectful. But I think that, knowing that there was a mental health crisis and not having all of the information, on the front end, I was disappointed. Clearly it's because they didn't have me to advise them. But I was disappointed, especially the ones that, I had very, good long-term friendships, relationships, people I would socialize with and have dinner with, just flipped on me at, but that's how vicious the mob is, and when you are in the crosshairs of the mob and, your business is on the line, I think that they get put into, I had lunch with a client of mine. And by the way, I've gotten back, 90% of the clients that did that to me.
That's awesome.
Which again is like, I am very much, a forgiving person. And, I that was one of the biggest lessons I had to learn because I've been known to hold a grudge myself. But, when clients came back and they would say, we're really proud of you, you've handled this like a champ, and, sat down, had lunch, and they're like, I want to apologize to you that we did. Like I had a number of clients say, I apologize to you that we did that, but you just got to know, what the calls we were getting, the emails we were getting, our clients, the clients that our business serves were being threatened. So, and especially when it's like, a brand that has done a lot of, diversity and inclusion work, and, that's part of their whole mission. There was just like nothing, like they were just done.
Well, and it's also interesting to me, I mean, without naming names, how many of these businesses that denounced you for knocking over a mask display were also very publicly supportive of Black Lives Matter? Right. The double standard of you have this little girl and you're like about the same size as me, maybe even smaller, like, knock down a couple masks off a display and it's just like all hell breaks loose. And then you have literal cities burning down and everybody praises them and acts like they're saints.
Well, and, what really breaks my heart truly about all of that is that, I felt really bad for what I did. I know, and it sounds silly on its face. Oh, you knocked over a display in Target. Okay, I cleaned it up, I put it in the cart, whatever. But I felt really bad about what I did because, anybody who knows me knows, that I'm very kind and conscientious of other people. Like, the way that I like sort of sniff somebody out is I'll take them to lunch, decide if I'm going to hire them, if I'm going to work with them, whatever, if I'll even represent them and see how they treat the wait staff. Like that was like always like my calling card was like, let me see it like how somebody treats the wait staff. So I felt really bad for the way that I acted. I know it was unbecoming and unprofessional. Just not who I am as a person. Like I was just not in a good position. And as far as I know, and I've been on CNN, I've been on every step, I've been on Washington, I've been everywhere, trying to make it right and like sincerely apologize for the things I said and the things I did and the people that I hurt and the people that I upset and anybody that I harmed, intentionally or unintentionally. As far as I know, to this day, I'm the only person who screwed up a store and did that. And still there are people who just refuse to forgive me.
Melissa,
and refuse to let it go.
The night that like the main Antifa, Black Lives Matter, whatever riots happened here in Scottsdale, Arizona, I was driving through it. Like when the Paul brother, whatever, was at the mall and then people were smashing into the Mercedes-Benz dealership, I was there at the stoplight driving and I was so scared for my life watching these people take bats and smash through these glass windows and everything. And that, like, nothing you did to me even compares to that. But like, how many of those people, lost their jobs or had all this fallout? That's what's crazy.
I'm glad. No, I'm glad you brought that up because that experience, and I've lived here, probably 21 years now. I love Scottsdale. I've been a big part of sort of the luxury branding of the city, and I'm so proud, of who we are and what we are here. And what happened that night was probably the most disturbing and violating thing that I have ever seen. I mean, I just remember I was at home and I remember watching it on TV and just tears were just like streaming down my face because I was like, why isn't anybody doing anything? And it's not like, I could care less if people want to. I mean, I take that back. I care that people damage property. I think it's wrong. I do. I just do.
Right.
So, I think that was for me, like emotionally, when you think of like all of the stuff that we went through in 2020, like the lockdowns being one thing, just watching, your city, just be, violated in such a way. I mean, and it was frightening. And there were where I live, like there were, rumors going out around that like the destruction was coming to the cities and the neighborhoods and stuff like that.
I was there. I was with that too.
It was very real. I mean, I packed my family up.
Yep.
And that was about a month before, my episode, I was so disturbed. You know, I packed my family up and we got in the car and we left and we just started driving north. I'm like, you know, we'll book something when we get there. If what they say, you know, is going to happen tonight, you know, that everybody was talking about, which was coming into the neighborhoods, and I lived across the street from the next neighborhood they were supposed going to hit. You know, that was something that just, I think that, you know, affected me just as much of the lockdowns, because my sense of safety was in question.
It felt literally like the purge. I ended up staying that night in a hotel in downtown Scottsdale with a girlfriend who was visiting from out of town, from out of state. And we were in this hotel, a nice hotel in downtown Old Town Scottsdale. And the hotel locked all the doors. They had their employees barricading the doors to the hotel because they thought that Antifa people were going to be coming and storming the lobbies and coming up to our rooms. We were so scared.
My entire neighborhood was surrounded with police barricades when we packed up and we went up north. Like when we pulled out of my neighborhood, there was lines of police cars blocking all of the major intersections. I mean, it was nothing I had ever seen in my lifetime. I never would ever want to. I don't think people really understand, you know, how real it got, you know, in Scottsdale for a minute. It was scary.
What was the turning point for your husband to decide, actually, I know I filed divorce papers, but I don't want to leave Melissa?
Well, I mean, you know, I had come to him, you know, looking at different options because, you know, I had at that point, you know, was able to kind of look back at the last year and be like, you know, I started this year at the top of my game. You know, my business had not been doing better. You know, I had just gotten some of like the biggest clients that I'd ever had. Like everything was amazing. You know, I was just on the top of the world. So in that hindsight where it went from, you know, the height of everything to just shambles, I was like, you know, this is a really good time for me to do some of that work, you know, that internal work that I had not been willing to do before. But I want to do my research and I want to find a way, you know, to do that, you know, in a really healthy environment. So we're really fortunate here in Arizona, you know, that we have plenty of different treatment facilities. And I mean, we're world renowned, you know, for our rehabs and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I had found it's an offshoot of the Meadows program, which, you know, Heidi Klum has spent time at, and Charlie Sheen. And, you know, they of course have like their inpatient rehab, but they have an outpatient trauma program that I went, you know, and did. And it was an 8-week intensive program, you know, and my husband, you know, was amenable to, you know, let's work on, and they had a family, like the part of the program was that, you know, it was a family therapy and stuff like that. So you could come together and kind of rebuild your family and stuff like that. But the stuff that I, you know, did in there, very little of it had to do with the target stuff at all. I mean, the majority was really just trying to unwind, you know, the trauma that I experienced with the loss of my parents and, you know, never dealing with that. And, you know, all of the stuff that, you know, had kind of been compressed into the lockdowns and the safety issue and the fear and all of that stuff. And just unwinding that from the beginning, you know, and kind of building myself back up.
Once you're institutionalized by the state, can they just show up at your door anytime?
Okay. So it happens a couple different ways. When you're in the hospital, and this, you know, I talked to several people in there, you know, I was shocked. This was what really motivated me to speak out and advocate for people in the mental health system. Some of the people have serious mental health problems, but not to the point where like they can't communicate and stuff like that. But some of them do, you know? So I was talking to people, you know, and you don't never know what anybody else's medical history is, but like they can decide, you know, they could have decided, no, you're just in here now. Like they can hold you, I think legally, up to 180 days or something like that, you know, without question. And then from there, you know, they can put you in, you know, a real state-run hospital if, you know, the situation's serious, whatever. What happens to most people who get like mandated into that system is they give you this diagnosis in the hospital and then they say, here's the medication that we say you should take after we've seen you twice in 7 days. And now if you don't take that, you have to go to like facilities and basically, you know, have the medication injected into you. And if you don't, you're like basically, you know, in contempt of the court, and the court can come and get you and basically put you back in the hospital. And if you get back in the hospital, you're in there.
Do you live in fear every day that could happen if you make one false move, that they're going to come get you?
I'm not mandated to any sort of medication. That's what I'm saying. It's like when I went against the court and they had no grounds to do anything like that towards me, thank God. Because if I was not able to advocate for myself, then yeah, they would have said, you're on this medication for the next year and you have to check in, with like a PO basically to make sure that, and that's the thing too, they take your blood. Like that's what they were saying is like they make sure that you have the amount of medication, they inject it in you, all of this stuff. Like there are people, walking around who've been through that system who that's their life. They are living that life. The state is mandating their medications, and if they do not comply, they are put into the hospital prison system, and that's their lifestyle. Like that was what I was up against when that happened.
It feels like you've totally been able to rebuild your life. Your business, your marriage has had restoration. What would you say to somebody that's facing something similar, maybe not quite to your level, but they have lost their job because of their political views or their religious beliefs, their personal relationships have fallen apart. How do they build back their life like you have? What is the Melissa Lively PR expertise on you've been canceled, now what?
I think it all comes down to mindset. I think you have to know, everybody has to know whether you've been canceled or not, that you are an immensely powerful, resilient human being. And shit happens, shit happens. I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to cuss on this, but that's life. We go through things that happen in life, and there is so much more ahead of you, and like this too shall pass. And I think, being a strong person, and also, you have to kind of go through the process of releasing that anger. I think about that all the time. Is like, I could wake up every day and be angry that I got canceled and angry that all this stuff happened to me and angry that I did it to myself. Like I could just be an angry person. I could. But instead, I decided to just look at the future and just put my shoes on, and just take one step at a time and just, people that I had wronged, make it right. And if not, also the other thing too is like, sometimes things happen, that are wild and unexpected in life, and it opens up a new pathway of opportunity for you. For me, I'm really good at what I do, and I love what I do, and I love the people that I work with. So it was really important to me to go back and make all of that right. And I think, when people finally, the dust settled, people who knew me were like, I was really, that was what I heard from people. I was just really worried about you. I was just so worried about you. And I'm glad that you're back and you're great and this, that, and the other. But, there's always hope and there's always future. And, if you, and this is, what I wrote my book about is like, you cannot cancel me because I will not cancel myself. And that is the mantra, that people have to get in their mind. It's like you will only be canceled if you allow them to cancel you. And I think, the best part of it all is that, despite the journey that I've been on and the trials and tribulations, I really feel like now, my marriage is stronger. My business is better than ever. The numbers are just where they were before the pandemic, if not better. And I'm working with the type of people who get me, who, there are no secrets, everything, you want to Google me. Like there's, it's all out there. And so I think that takes a lot of the fear away, because there's literally nothing you can say about me or do to me that's going to take anything away from me that I've built, and before I was ready to give that all on the table, and I no longer.
A lot of conservative business owners feel like they have to hide the fact that they're conservative in order to keep their business afloat. What is your advice, PR advice on that? Should you feel free to be openly conservative and just let those customers leave if they want to leave? Or do you think it is better in this culture right now to kind of keep that under wraps?
I think at the end of the day, I was never, again, political, left, right, anything before any of this. I consider myself, to be a libertarian. And that's why I'm good at what I do, is because I put business first. And, I at the end of the day, I think, run your business. I would say do your best to keep, and I know it's hard now because social media is just so easy, obviously, to kind of, there is no separation from the business owner and the business. But I do think, stand in your values. I don't think it helps the conversation to be aggressive, and air out, every thought. The purpose of social media is not to air out every thought and emotion you ever have. Find a different avenue for that, and think twice before you post. I think stand in your ground and say and do what you think is right. But I don't go looking for trouble. I think a lot of people do that now.
Don't Instagram live yourself and Target.
It actually worked out very well for me. I'm talking to you. But, don't recommend it. If I could do it again, I probably would not have done that. But I think that you've got to stand up for what you believe in is right and do right by people and be, have good ethics and operate with integrity in everything you do. And I think people will see that. I work with clients that, are on, categorize themselves as left-leaning, right-leaning, up-leaning, down-leaning. And I think we come to terms and respect each other, in that we want to work together to make good things happen. And I think it's foolish. I guarantee you, there are, people who, say, oh, I don't want to work with this person or that person because of what their beliefs are or whatever. And, I'm a very strong believer, my story being proof positive that if you, work hard and be kind and, do right and stick by your morals, good things will come to you and the right people who you want to be around will come to you. Absolutely.
Now, the name of your book is You Can't Cancel Me, The Story of My Life. And is that out yet? Is it coming out?
It's not out yet. I've been writing it, obviously since all of this happened. And it's funny because when I first got approached by publishers, they were like, write about QAnon, write about QAnon. I'm like, what am I going to write about QAnon? Like, I honestly, I'm not an expert in QAnon by any stretch of the imagination. It was a small sliver of my story. And I'm, not done telling it yet. I've come through a lot and, I'm trying to write that ending, and I'm really, really liking where it's going because, you can come full circle. And it's a little bit of like a handy dandy guide, from a PR perspective of what to do if this happens to you, because I've lived it, and I haven't lived by any sort of a script. I've honestly, just told my story from the heart. And a lot of it is embarrassing and a lot of it is painful and unpleasant. But, every time I tell it, it gets easier. And I hope that it reaches somebody that it helps. And, at the end of the day, we're all human. And that's all we can ask for is just a little bit of grace.
What is your Instagram so that people can be following you so they know when the book finally comes out that it's out?
It's at Melissa Ryan Lively.
Melissa, I cannot tell you how excited I am to have heard this in person. I feel like you really gave some extra context to explain where your head was at, what happened, why it happened, how you turned out. I think your story's full of hope for people who have experienced anything, of the sort in that realm of just being canceled or people coming after your business or whatever for making a mistake. And we all go through it. And I also think you shed light on something so important, which is the mental health crisis in this country and how it's been totally botched from a government standpoint on how it's handled. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing that.
Mental health and wellness should not be a luxury. So I hope that, the efforts that I'm making and others are making can make it accessible and we start, rethinking the way that we approach all healthcare in this country from a way that actually heals people.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thanks for having me.
We talk about cancel culture all the time, but it's because of how quickly it's devolved into just writing someone's life off. Literal people get canceled online, they lose friends or jobs, and this isn't normal. Was attacking a Target display a good idea? No, not at all. But did it make Melissa a bad person or warrant how she's been treated since? I don't think so. The world shut down nearly 2 years ago. What did they think was going to happen to people's mental health? This is why I wanted Melissa to come on to tell her story. Because despite losing so much both before and after her breakdown, Melissa is still writing her own story. There is redemption, even when you think that you've really messed up, or maybe you haven't, and people are merely trying to cancel you because they don't agree with you. Whatever it is, only you have the power to truly let yourself be canceled or not. The year isn't over yet. We still have 3 more episodes of The Spillover before season 2 of the show will start in the new year. And yes, you are even getting Christmas week and New Year's Eve episodes. I'm not leaving you hanging. My daily show, if you haven't followed on Instagram, is called Poplitics. It's your one-stop shop for all things pop culture without the leftist propaganda. And we just dropped brand new merch in time for Christmas. Shop TPUSA.com for cute hoodies, joggers, hats, and stickers. Actually, the hoodie I'm wearing right now. If you have an amazing story, good or bad, that you think I may be interested in hearing for The Spillover, or you know someone who does, DM me on Instagram at @RealAlexClark or @Poplitics. I am always looking for stories and interesting guests just like Melissa. Make sure you leave your weekly 5-star review, even if all you say is revived my soul and saved my marriage. I don't know, make something up. You can watch each episode of The Spillover on the Poplitics YouTube channel. We're back next Thursday at 9 p.m. Pacific and midnight Eastern on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Love you, mean it. Bye.
Big dog status, I'm a big dog, I pull up on the block.